So I'm presenting some initial findings on survey and excavation at Horndean on the Lower Tweed. And this is a project undertaken by myself and colleagues Kai and Cullen. So the work came about as part of the Uncovering the Tweed project, which is a strand of the much larger destination Tweed, which is a major revitalisation project working to conserve, celebrate and share the nature, history and stories of the River Tweed. The project is community-led, and at Horndean alone, the team comprised over 40 adult volunteers, contributing around 110 person days, and we had young learners from the Swinton Primary, which is the local school, and a group of young adults from the Borders Additional Needs Group working with us on the project. So, Horndean is one of a number of sites with evidence for medieval settlement in the Lower Tweed region. One of the project themes is focused on identifying, exploring and characterising rural medieval settlement along the Tweed, and we have around 3,000 known deserted medieval settlements, or DMVs, in Britain, and these are settlements abandoned and eventually disappearing almost entirely, with many low-lying examples truncated or masked by later post-medieval activity and the intensive agricultural regimes of the more recent centuries. Together with our volunteers, we've been tracing these lost villages through historic maps, archival records, and through the ephemeral and sometimes truncated remains visible on the ground. We've had some great finds from the high-resolution LiDAR survey data, and have then followed that up with geophysical survey and excavation where possible. So Horndean Church was first referred to in the 12th century, with the last minister noted around 1574. Horndean ceased to be a separate parish in 1576, but the burial ground appears to have continued in use until around the 19th century, based on inscriptions from some of the gravestones. Some sources, including Binney, note that Robert Bissett, or Bissett, Lord of the Manor of Upsetlington, founded St Lunner's Hospital of Horndean in around 1140. The hospital was granted to the monks of Kelso with 6 hectares, some fishings in the Tweed, and a park in the tenement of Upsetlington. In return, Kelso Abbey required to provide 1 chaplain and provision of the care for 2 paupers. The master of the hospital was clearly in post and witnessed a charter in the mid-12th century, proving that the hospital was up and running by then, and the hospital was also mentioned as being held by Kelso in 1300. But by the time of Binney writing, the exact location of St Leonard's Hospital was unknown, with just a note saying it was somewhere between Horndean and the Tweed. The 1897 Ordnance Survey map indicates the possible site of the hospital adjacent to the church, which you can see on the screen. And interestingly, on the LiDAR data at the southern edge of the modern agricultural field, you can see the remains of medieval rig and furrow cultivation, which has a distinctive S-shaped curve. And we've been finding hints of these deserted settlements and the field systems associated with them, often surviving on the margins of the modern fields where the intensive ploughing hasn't stretched right to the edge. So we undertook geophysical survey across several of the large fields around the site to provide some context. And we identified previously unknown features which are evident on both our resistivity and gradiometry data sets. In particular, I'll draw attention to this subrectilinear enclosure feature, which appears to respect the church boundary wall, and also several anomalies which are visible internal to this. So we undertook 5 small machine-dug evaluation trenches, which were targeted over geophysical anomalies. Trenches 1 and 4 on the left investigated the possible enclosure feature. Trench 2 was to characterise the disturbance of the historic field boundary, which you can see on the historic maps, and you can see the disturbance in that hashered area running across the site. And trenches 3 and 5 were to investigate some of the anomalies we were picking up in the interior to see if we could define what sort of activities are happening inside the enclosure and what period that they're dated to. This aerial shot shows both trenches 1 and 4 in the foreground, with the church behind on the back right. And we identified the substantial ditch feature, which corresponded nicely with the enclosure noted on the geophysics in both of these trenches. The ditch section in the north, pictured on the top left of this slide, was 4 metres wide and about 1.5 metres deep, so quite a substantial feature. It was relatively V-shaped in profile, with remnants of an upcast bank along the interior edge. And the ditch in this location had clearly been infilled with lots of multiple separate, relatively sterile dumps of material. It was recut at least once, indicating ongoing maintenance and reuse of the feature. So this is the second slot through the ditch in the other trench closer to the church, and it had similar evidence for multiple deposits infilling the ditch over time, as well as a relict upcast bank on the interior. But here the material was much more charcoal flecked, containing fragments of burnt bone, and lots of artefacts, which indicated the deposition of midden waste from a nearby settlement was being put into the ditch at various points. Its closer proximity to the church, which sits on a nice flat terrace, could be why there's more of a concentration of midden material here. We're in closer proximity to buildings related to the settlement. The lower and middle fills contained a whetstone and a large assemblage of fairly well-preserved disarticulated animal bones. Species which were identified on site by the excavators included cattle, sheep and goat. We had some pig jaw fragments and even some horse. Butchery marks were evident on some of the bones, and this could indicate disposal of processed carcasses and also cooking waste in the form of some of the burnt bone. And critically, in the same lower fills of the ditch, an assemblage of medieval pottery was evident, including a couple fragments of Scottish medieval redware and around 30 fragments of Scottish white gritty ware, representing several different vessels, including at least one which has been identified as a cooking pot. White gritty ware can date in production from around the 12th century AD, which is similar to the earliest references we have to the church at this site, and it continued in production until around the 15th century. So if we combine the medieval pottery assemblage with the animal bone, I think we can indicate the presence of a medieval settlement in this location, with the community depositing waste in the enclosure ditch. Several substantial sherds of pot were identified right at the base of the ditch, which is quite critical because it indicates that the ditch is most likely cut in this period as well, with very little time to silt up before midden material started to be deposited. Analysis of the faunal assemblages, processing of bulk samples, followed by identifying ecofacts and any subsequent radiocarbon dating of features is all still to be finalised. But I think it's clear from the preservation of the animal bone that we'll probably be able to help contribute to our understanding of rural communities' diets, among other research gaps that have been highlighted on the recently released CESARF medieval chapter. Internal features within the enclosure area included several very truncated shallow linear gullies, a few pits, and a section of cobbled surface pictured in the bottom left. It's likely that this is all remains of quite ploughed out medieval structures or features associated with them, and the surface itself could indicate a yard space or potentially a track running between structures towards the church enclosure. So is there a medieval hospital at Horndean? Well, actually, probably not. Piers Dixon, who's been working with us as a consultant on the project, is working with us to investigate the nearby site of Upsetlington. During research for this, he came across the hospital charter for Horndean, and his new translation of the Latin indicates that the hospital is actually more likely in nearby Upsetlington rather than Horndean. Review of the translation, confirmed by John Gilbert, confirmed that the charter only really mentions Horndean as a geographical reference rather than locating the hospital there. So what we found at Horndean is much more likely to be a medieval rural settlement, dating to at least the 12th to 13th centuries AD, potentially a little earlier and potentially extending a bit later. The shape and plan of the enclosure ditch is superficially at least reminiscent of a moated enclosure, but the scale of it combined with the V-shaped profile of the ditch, the upcast bank on the interior, all are features that are not particularly in keeping with the raised flat interior of other known moated sites. The faunal assemblage is rare for a Scottish rural site, which is really good for us in terms of understanding things like diet and the community that lived there. But the pottery that we've found so far is similar to other rural sites such as Springwood Park and Eyemouth. So this is a really exciting development for the project. It feeds both into our understanding of the ongoing work we're doing at Upsetlington, and it also means we've identified coherent evidence for medieval rural settlement likely associated with the church. As the new research framework highlights, these sites can be particularly hard to find in terms of good surviving examples in agricultural zones, so it's a really valuable discovery for the region. So stay posted for more developments. The Uncovering the Tweed project is ongoing until mid-2027, so if you're interested in getting involved, please sign up to our mailing list to find out about more events. You can also see our results as they emerge on the Destination Tweed website, which is marked on the slide there. And finally, a huge thank you to all our volunteers and the collaborators listed here for their work at Horndean so far, and to the funders of Uncovering the Tweed listed on the left of the slide there. Thank you.